Reddit has been under fire recently for changes that they're making to their API access. Many of the services that we use on a daily basis invoke API calls. We're going to review some of the articles that outline these changes and Reddit's reaction to the response from the community. Also, I'll briefly demonstrate how you can leverage APIs to collect data, make changes, and more. If you enjoy these tech videos, hit the like button and subscribe for future updates. This article from the New York Times: thousands of Reddit communities stay dark as app policy protest continues. Thousands of volunteer run message boards on Reddit remained dark Tuesday, a week after moderators of the communities began what they called a 48-hour protest. More than 3,200 message boards remain restricted or private, down from nearly 9,000 the previous week. Moderators of some of the communities that reopened said they had done so after Reddit threatened to replace them. We want what's best for this community, and we have no choice but to open it back up or have it open up for us, said the Apple subreddit. The backlash erupted last week over changes that Reddit announced in April when it said that it would begin to charge for some large-scale companies to access its Application Programming Interface, or API, the method through which outside entities can download and process the social network's vast selection of memes, GIFs, videos, and conversation threads. Reddit said that it no longer wanted to give away such valuable assets to companies like Google, OpenAI, and Microsoft, which have been using its data to develop artificial intelligence systems. But some Reddit users and developers said that the pricing scheme would kill off popular third-party applications that people rely on to browse and comment on the site. Moderators said that the changes would hurt some of the tools that they use to manage discussions on the site itself. Starting on June 12th, many Reddit moderators made their communities private or inaccessible to members for at least 48 hours. Some users had trouble using the site that day, and Reddit said that a significant number of subreddits shifting to private caused some expected stability issues. There are a lot of subreddits still holding on that have a lot of frustration over how the whole thing has been handled, and the unwillingness of Reddit to give in an inch here, said Christian Seelig, the developer of Apollo. Mr. Seelig said that he planned on shutting down the app on June 30th, a day before he said he would have to begin incurring a $20 million annual charge under Reddit's new pricing plan. Despite the turmoil, Reddit CEO Steve Huffman has indicated that Reddit, which is preparing for a possible initial public offering later this year, will not change course. He told NBC News last week that Reddit was considering allowing users to vote out moderators who led the protest and were thwarting the site's democratic ethos. The problem with this one is that it's not going to change anything because we've already made a business decision that we're not negotiating on. Mr. Seelig said that developers and moderators were not opposed to Reddit's charging for the access to its data. He said that they had asked the company to consider charging less and offering more time before the new prices took effect. Instead, company leaders walled themselves off and said, "You don't matter, we will stick through this," and that's where a lot of the frustration cuts through. The next article from Forbes: stolen Reddit data to be published unless API changes are dropped, hackers say. The Black Cat ransomware criminal group hacked into Reddit's servers earlier this year, a breach that Reddit confirmed in February. It was reported that while the hackers gained access to internal documents and codes, as well as internal dashboards and business systems, there was no evidence that production systems were breached or users' accounts accessed. The group is demanding $4.5 million and the scrapping of its API price changes, or it will publish 80 gigabits of stolen data. From PC Mag, Reddit goes nuclear, removes moderators of subreddits that continue to protest. Several subreddits have begun to allow adult content and not safe for work material to protest Reddit. In response, the platform has removed entire moderator teams from the affected subreddits. Reddit has taken a drastic step to crush protest against the social media platform by removing entire moderating teams from several popular subreddits. The company did so after the subreddits began to allow adult material and other not safe for work content in an effort to keep protesting Reddit's controversial API change. By permitting the not safe for work content, subreddits have been trying to undermine Reddit's ability to generate ad revenue. In response, Reddit has been moving swiftly to crack down on the protest tactic. The platform has removed the entire volunteer moderation teams for several subreddits. "I honestly don't have the words for the situation right now," a moderator for one of the subreddits said. "No communication, no attempt to seriously answer any questions, but still going in and removing our posts, literally locking us out of our accounts. removing the entire moderation team and entirely ignoring the 40,000 people who voted to either take the sub private or to open it with new rules. Reddit is justifying the action, saying the affected subreddits broke the rules. Moderators incorrectly marking a community as not safe for work is a violation of both our content policy and the moderator code of conduct. Reddit further told PC Mag it's not okay to show people not safe for work content when they don't want to see it. In line with our conduct code, we've removed moderators and restrict communities where moderators are engaging in malicious conduct. The threat caused many subreddits to open back up this week after 8,400 of them went private, thereby preventing users from accessing them in an effort to protest the company. But now many subreddits are tapping at other forms of protest, whether it be allowing not safe for work content or enacting other ridiculous rules such as only permitting users to post content about John Oliver. Meanwhile, other subreddits have chosen to remain private. However, Reddit has begun messaging them demanding that they reopen or else. If this community remains private, we will reach out soon with information on what steps will take place. Now, I'm going to demonstrate how we can use APIs in a moment, but first I want to give my thoughts on this situation. Reddit has the right to charge for API access, but I also believe that they should be fair in doing so. From one of the articles that we read, the change was intended to charge AI developers for using the platform, the contents on the platform, not to punish third-party app developers. So with that in mind, I believe that it's fairly simple for Reddit to just charge third-party app developers a different rate than what you would bill an AI company, a company like Google, Microsoft, or OpenAI. You can charge them a higher price point than, say, a third-party app developer that is just trying to improve the experience of somebody that's using the platform. Additionally, you can just give developers more time. If they have more time to review the code base and further optimize and reduce the amount of API calls that they're making, they can save costs that way. Also, it gives them time to adjust their subscription models to account for the increased costs that the API changes are going to have on these developers. With that being said, Reddit has handled this quite poorly in a number of ways. Firstly, while API changes were communicated early, the cost wasn't disclosed until a month before the changes were to go into effect. So while the developers knew for a month or two that changes were coming, they didn't know the extent of the changes. They weren't aware of what they were actually going to be built. That was only made aware recently, and they've effectively only had a month to try and prepare and get ready for that. And the API developers have calculated the cost to be quite excessive. Twitter was ridiculed earlier this year for its price of $42,000 for 50 million tweets. The Apollo developer calculates his cost to be $12,000 for 50 million requests. And in comparison, he pays Imager, a site that is similar to Reddit in user base and media, $166 for the same 50 million API calls. Thirdly, the rotating mod teams. In many cases, the mod teams are enacting measures of protest that is within the support of the community. And Reddit removing those mods does not reflect the site's democratic ethos. And while Reddit may claim that the mods were removed for code of conduct violations, it's hard to ignore the conflicts of interest that they have to restore ad revenue onto their platform. And the last point that I want to make is that volunteers run Reddit. The moderators are not paid for any of the contributions that they make. They're just volunteers doing the best that they can with the tools that they have. And unfortunately, the official Reddit app has been criticized extensively for providing a poor experience in this regard. Many of these volunteers, these moderators, they use third-party applications to get their job done. So with these changes happening on the API access side and with the eventual removal of these third-party applications, these moderators are going to be forced to use either the website or the official Reddit application, which is going to make ultimately their life that much harder for a job that they're really not even being paid for in the first place. But that's my thoughts on it, and I'd like to know what your thoughts are on all of this. Is Reddit justified in charging over 7,000% more than Imager for the same number of API calls? Were the subreddit mods removed for code of conduct violations or to restore ad revenue? Let me know in the comments section below. To demonstrate APIs, I'm going to use Cisco Modeling Labs. This is a virtualized networking environment that I have running on a rack mount server. And this allows me to spin up multiple devices, connect them together, and lab up different scenarios. So if I wanted to go over how to configure OSPF or BGP or VLAN trunking, this is how I would do so. I would go into this interface. I would say, grab a router, throw it up here, power it up, and then I would connect it to another device, like say another router or a firewall. So this allows you to effectively virtualize common network components that you would operate with on a daily basis: routers, switches, firewalls, Unix servers, and so forth. Now, this also has an integrated API capability within it as well. So if I go to the API documentation, which is commonly referred to as a Swagger, I can see here that there's many different endpoints that are available in different buckets. So API endpoints are, you would hit an API endpoint when you make an API call. You're making it against an endpoint that serves a certain function. So for example, I would use an HTTP post if I want to authenticate against that system and get a web token. Now, in this case, Cisco Modeling Labs has made it quite simple where you can actually run a lot of these API calls directly from this interface because this is on the same host that I am currently logged into. So, for example, if I wanted to go down to users and I wanted to get a list of available users, I can just click try this out, hit execute, and it'll give me a list of the users. Now, most API calls are not going to just do it for you, right? It'll give you something similar to this where it will say, if you want to get a list of users, you use a get method, and it'll give you a list of requirements up here or some sample code that shows this is the information that you need to supply if you want to get this type of data. So, but it's not going to just say, click to execute and I'm going to run it on your behalf. So you're going to have to do, some of this work on your own. So usually the first thing to do is you would have to get an authentication token. In this case, it's quite simple. Inside of here, I can just click my name and I can hit copy JSON web token, and that'll give me a token. So if I go into my editor here, I can just paste that there, and this is my token. Now, this is not the format that I need to that I'm able to use. I need to format this a little bit. And this is all going to be written in Python. If you are interested in, say, more Python videos or more API videos, leave a comment below. Let me know. That way I know what you're interested in, and then I can make more of those as needed. But for this to work, there's a few things that we're going to need to do. First, we have to import requests. And this allows us to actually make HTTP requests to the endpoint that we're trying to communicate with. This is going to allow us to grab information, to make changes, so on and so forth. And the next thing that we're going to have to do is import JSON. APIs are typically communicated with in JSON formatting, so you're going to have to be aware of how to use JSON and so forth. The next thing that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to make some headers. So for us to communicate and to authenticate, we're going to have to format the HTTP headers in a certain way that the server is looking for. And this is all within the documentation. So if we go back to the documentation that we have here, we should see that for, let's see. Let's see, where is it? Here we go. Authentication of API endpoints requires an authentication token, must be conveyed as an HTTP header, and the name of the header is authorization, and the content is bearer. So what this is going to look like is something like this. So if we say this is going to be CML headers is what we'll call it. And it's going to be content type application JSON. And then we're going to say authorization. And I can't spell, so excuse me for that. And this is going to be bearer, followed by the JSON web token. So again, if we go back, we look at the documentation. The name of the header must be authorization, and the content is bearer, followed by the token itself. So if we want to do a call and say, get the list of available users. So we know that we already did this call before, and when we executed it, we got this output right here. This is a response that we received. So if we take a look at how we're supposed to make this call, we need to make the call against the API endpoint. So right now we know that the base URL is cml.renegade.net. That's my CML instance. And then this is the API server, so we have to append this at the back of it. So we have that information, which we can call the CML host. And we'll put that as https cml.renegade.net/API/version 0. And that is the base URL that we need to communicate with the API server. Now, remember, each one of these is an API endpoint. We need to invoke or specify that particular endpoint to communicate with when we're making our call. Otherwise, the server doesn't know what you're doing. So if you just pass an authentication token, the server isn't going to know what to do because you didn't specify what endpoint you're trying to communicate with. So in this case, we're trying to get a list of users. So our endpoint is /users, and we can just put it on the back just like that. So now we have our headers. We have our URL that we need to communicate with. So now we can craft our request that we're going to make. So we're going to say request equals request.get. Yep, this is a get operation. And then inside of this get operation, we're going to say that we're communicating with the CML host. And I'm going to put a verify flag of false. And the only reason I'm doing this is a home lab environment. I don't have a certificate, and otherwise Python is going to yell at me. And then we're going to set the headers to be the CML headers that we previously created. And then this is .json. And then what we're going to do is, if I run that just as it is, this is going to run, but you're not going to see any output because you have to print the output to the terminal. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to say print JSON dumps r indent equals 4. Now what we're doing here is we're going to say, okay, we're going to print the dump. We're going to dump out the output of the JSON response, which is the variable of r. And we're also going to format that by indenting it by 4. So this is going to make it a bit more easier to read on the eyes. So if we run this, we'll see here that we got a little bit of an error message here saying that it's unverified HTTPS. However, we can see that we got the CM output, right? We got the user was built a day ago because I rebuilt the machine a day ago. It has this lab currently available, and this is all the users that are currently built. Now, what if I didn't have that indent there? What would it look like if you happen to be curious? It'll just look like one big run-on right here. So as you can see, adding the indent just makes it a little bit easier for it to read. Now, also, if I just delete this print line right here, just to kind of illustrate that point, this code runs, but you didn't see any of the output. And you didn't see that output because we didn't print it out, right? So that's a real quick primer on how you would, at a basic level, create the headers that you need, how you would identify the endpoint to communicate with, and how you would formulate a quick request to grab the data that you want. So we went over how to create some basic API calls and collect information from the host. What if we wanted to do something a little bit more advanced? Not only can we retrieve information from the host, but we could also make changes to the host as well with API calls. So, say we're doing something where we need to add multiple nodes to the lab. Let's say we're going to lab full mesh BGP. And to do that, we need to add 5 routers. Now, we could go through the web interface and we can do that. So we can go into the web interface here and we could say, okay, well, let me grab this router, drag it all in here, connect it all up, and so on and so forth. However, the other thing that we can do is use API calls. So if we take a look at the API endpoints that are available to us, the one thing that we can do is, let's see here. So we can create, I believe I saw create nodes here. Here we go, nodes. So lab, this endpoint right here, labs, lab ID, followed by nodes. Add a node to the specified lab. So this has a required data field. So we need to specify which lab we want to add the nodes to. So how do we get that information? If we take a look at the other endpoints that are available, we can see /labs gives us a list of all the labs visible to the user. So if we go back to this here that we already built, we'll put back the indent to make it readable, and we just change users to labs. Let's run this. Unauthorized. Okay, so the JSON web token probably expired. Let's log out. And we'll log back in. Copy. Paste. Run. There we go. So now we have our lab ID. And we can take this and for our call, we know that it is going to be this lab ID. So it'll be labs, lab ID, followed by nodes. So this is the endpoint that we need to hit in order to create the devices that we need. Now, if we're going to create 5 devices, we're going to need to do some sort of loop in order to make this work. So the first thing that we need to do is make our loop. So what we'll do is we'll say that I equals 0, and we'll say while I is less than 5, and then this is where we're going to do our function, right? So, and we could test this out without even making the API call first. So if I just comment this out, I can say that and this just means that we're going to increment I by 1 at the end of the loop. So if I do print I, we should get 0 through 4. Let's go ahead and run this. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So while I is less than 5, so right now I is equal to 1, we go through the loop, I, which is 0, plus 1 equals 1. So we go back to the top of the loop, and then we're doing 1 plus 1 is 2, 2 plus 2 is 3, so on and so forth, right? So this is going to run 5 different times if you include 0. So what we can now do is we can load up the data that we need. And if we take a look at the call that we're going to make, there is some information here that we need to supply if we're going to make this API call. So we'll call this nodes. Okay. And let's see what we have here. So we need to align this a little bit. Formatting is a bit off. There we go. Okay. So this is the information that we need to supply. So the X and the Y axis can stay the same. The label, what we can do is this will be what appears on the web interface. So we can set CSR 1000V, which is what we're going to be using. And what I'm going to do is set this with the variable I. So it'll be CSR 1000V-0-123, just like we see right here. And for the configuration, and this is a formatted string, by the way, it just allows me to put the variable inside of what would typically be a string. And we're going to do the same thing for this configuration here. We're going to say host name is router followed by the number. And for the image definition, this is actually going to be none. And we don't need to provide any of this information because this is a built-in device. We don't have to worry about supplying CPU memory, any of that. That's all specified by the software, the CML software, so we don't have to worry about it. For hide links, this is going to be false because I want to be able to see the links. Actually, I'm sorry, this is going to be true. But we can't pass true. We have to pass it as a Boolean. So we're going to set that to Boolean value of 1, which is true. For tags, we actually don't need any tags. This is not all these fields are required. So we'll go ahead and leave that out here. And for the node definition, this is going to be when you go through the web interface, when you select one of these devices, that's the device right here that you're going to be touching. That is the node definition. So we want to use the CSR 1000V since that's what we're going to be using. So CSR 1000V. Okay. Now, we already know that when we loop through, we get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's good. And this is how we're going to create our nodes. So we're going to build our request here. So we're going to say build nodes equals to requests dot, this is probably a post, but let's take a look. Yep, this is a post method, so that's what we're going to use. And we're going to pass the endpoint, which is the CML host. And we're going to put in verify false, just like we did before. We're going to put in our headers, which are CML headers. And then we're going to specify our data, which is JSON dumps nodes. And then what we can do is, instead of printing out that, we will print out JSON dumps build nodes indent 4. So if we take a look at this loop and what it's doing, so for this loop, we have specified the nodes that we want to build. As it goes through, I is currently 0. However, at the end of this loop, it'll be incremented by 1. So it starts off as 0. The label will be CSR 1000V-0, router 0 for the host name. And then it'll go through, make an API call, passing all of that data. And then it will increment I by 1, run through, do it again. And we should get 5 nodes, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. All right, so every time we ran that, we got back an ID value, which should be a logical ID of the 5 different nodes that we just created. So let's go back into the web interface. And let's get out of the lab, go back in. And here we go. These are all 5 of the devices that we just created.